I hope you had a good break there for lunch. Up next is Mike Shylanski. Mike has a varied background. Born in St. Louis, moved to Washington, gained a love of the B&O in Washington, especially the Chessie Steam Special. Mike is a member of several societies, Baltimore and Ohio being one, as well as being a member of the NMRA, NRHS. He's done a number of presentations for the Historical Society, as well as for some railroad prototype modelers meets. He is also a director at large, and I'm sure you've seen him, and probably if you attended the mini-con we had in Lorraine, will remember Mike for being responsible for videotaping and audio taping the oral presentations that we had regarding the talks between the retired members of the B&O Railroad that occurred at the round table there. And I understand Mike is a fancier of a wine and likes to combine his wine trips with his rail trips. I got to travel more with Mike. There's no doubt about that. I also want to thank him for being a veteran. And I'd like to thank everybody out there who has served and have done their part to maintain our freedom. And thank you for being a veteran, and I hope we're all remembered here at the end of the month. With that, let me kick it over to Mike, and Mike is going to do Eisenhower Rides the B&O.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, now
can't see you yet, but
I can. Yeah, I'm having some issues with video here. Let's see what we have.
Lower left is video on.
Yeah.
As well as mute.
Very strange. Okay, here we go. It says the co-host has asked you to start. Okay, let me start. It works. Good. Okay, great. Now, let's try the all-important screen sharing. Yes, indeed. And I'm sharing someone else's screen.
Yeah, we may have to get Nick Fry re-involved again, as we did earlier with Steve, in order to get that share screen rights shared with you so that you can present.
Let's try again. There it is down there. Maybe I can get it up. Ah, okay, it worked. Very good.
Oh, there it is.
Well, there we are. Let's start from the beginning. Excellent. Well, I want to thank everyone for being with me on what, at least here in the East, is a very nice day. I'm very pleased you're spending some time with the B&O Railroad Historical Society and with me and with my buddy Ike. But I hope to build on what Steve Salomon talked about earlier. There will be a tiny bit of repetition, but for the most part, there will be new material here. There will be some Ohio material here, since it was indeed an Ohio mini-con. So I want to start out by thanking people. Bob Withers, I don't believe he's on, but Bob Withers has written some wonderful material and does some great research on the presidential trips on the B&O, the Road of the Presidents. I was able to speak with Bill Howes, mostly about the funeral train. A gentleman named Rosavink helped me a lot with the Defiance, Ohio portion. And there are various libraries and historical societies that helped me in many kind ways. And you will see a number of great press photographs and even some articles, which I have drawn from heavily. So I want to thank all these individuals. And again, thank you, the audience, for being there. How did this all start? Well, some of you know that I like to go to various research centers and see what they have on the B&O and the Chessie system. So in the Maryland Rail Heritage Library, which is the second floor of the Streetcar Museum in Baltimore, I was looking through their collection and found this item. It is a very ornate, if a little tattered, menu from a presidential trip from Washington to Toledo in 1953. So that got me started. I had not really heard about this before, and I've always been interested in government and international affairs and worked in defense for many years. So this got my attention. really was curious on how such a trip was pulled off and how it was done securely. So I've done several years of research since then and built on a lot of the good work of Bob Withers and others. And let me share some of that with you. First of all, how did Eisenhower's trains differ from the ones, say, of Truman, who we saw earlier? Well, first of all, President Roosevelt traveled thousands of miles by train, quite extensively, and often by the B&O. And as Steve mentioned earlier today, Truman did indeed travel a lot on the B&O. Truman loved driving himself, but of course, once he became president, that was a lot tougher. He rode the B&O a fair amount, and he also called it his favorite railroad. Now, we know that Truman loved cab rides as well, and there is some evidence to suggest that Truman actually operated a B&O unit for a while. He was at the controls and actually was running the train. Now, by contrast, President Eisenhower, subject to my talk, he traveled a lot less by rail. He made two very long campaign trips, one of which we'll talk about a little bit here. And he made some shorter official trips once president on various railroads. Okay? And it's not that I dislike trains. Actually, he liked railroaders and the sort of efficient organization of railroads, which must have reminded him of his military experiences. We're told by some of the historians that as a boy, he actually idolized a local engineer in Kansas. Who knows what might have happened had he pursued a railroad career. There is other evidence to suggest he enjoyed being with rail workers, both on the campaign trail and as a president. And this was similar to the way he had mingled with the troops in some of the famous pictures of activity prior to D-Day in particular. Now, it's also true that his wife, Mamie Eisenhower, basically hated flying. She loved to go by train, but she really didn't like flying. She actually talked her husband out of joining the Air Corps when he was early in his Army career. So again, what would have happened had this not occurred? Mamie really had a great time on the campaign trains, and we'll talk about how I felt about them momentarily. But she had a ball, really enjoyed it. And that was another indication the Eisenhowers did not dislike trains. And Mamie actually rode the B&O even more than Ike did. And I would like to add before I forget that after he was out of office, Ike continued to ride by trains, and the family made an annual trip from Gettysburg to California by train for several years. Now, the times and the trains themselves were changing. Security needs were really increasing here in the Cold War era. The rail routes were extremely expensive to secure, and we talked a little bit about that earlier in Steve's presentation, and I'll talk about it some more. Meanwhile, the roads were getting better, and of course, as many of you know, Eisenhower was considered the father of the interstate, but we're going to talk about times a little before that. But the roads were indeed improving in post-war America, so it was easier to do presidential travel by road. But the most important thing for changing away from the trains for the president was the improvement in presidential aircraft. So by now, Eisenhower had his own plane. In fact, he was onto his second plane. You can see a photo of it here. It was called the Columbine II, a nice Lockheed plane. And this is a photo of 1953, the time that we'll be talking about momentarily. So a pretty spiffy looking plane, small, and nothing like today's super luxurious Air Force One. But the Columbine II wasn't bad for its day. And I believe this was even the first aircraft to be called Air Force One, which is another story entirely. Now, times again were changing. The equipment that was being used for the presidential trains, like the one that Steve showed us earlier for Truman, was dating. So the Ferdinand Magellan, and here's a shot of it a little bit before the Reagan incarnation. This is actually the Truman incarnation. This was a really heavy car, and it had a concrete floor that had been added, bulletproof glass, thick armor, and yes, it went from 80 tons to 140 some odd tons. It was heavy. It was tough to run a train with this at the end of it. It was done. We had some great engineers in those days, and the host railroads, of course, wanted to put their best foot forward. B&O certainly did. So even though it was tough to handle a train with something this heavy on the end, they still were willing to do that. But it was not fun, and there was some discussion about dispensing with the Magellan. And the accommodations on the presidential trains, which were put together, were kind of basic. I mean, the reporters had tables and working areas, and the dining cars were largely intended for them on these trains. So they did have some facilities, but it really was kind of a tough life if you were on the road, say, for up to a month with one of these candidates. It was not necessarily a lot of fun. And more modern communications were needed for the president and certainly for the press. Some of you may know that up until 1952, a B&O baggage car had been leased and was full of communications equipment for the presidential trains. But as Eisenhower came in, the lease was terminated, although the car was still returned to the B&O and used for a while. And we'll show you shortly that a new car was put on. But it was definitely seen as a time to change the presidential train and perhaps to change the way the president traveled. But what was going to remain the same in the Eisenhower era? Security. And we talked a little bit earlier about how the B&O was coordinating some of the security and some of the special measures that were taken, and I'll run over some of them again. This was always a high priority. Admirably so with most of the railroads, especially the B&O. There was definite prestige in hosting Eisenhower, a great hero, beloved by the country. There's no doubt that a railroad was happy to have Ike on the line and get the publicity that would follow. And a sign of the favor of the railroads that hosted these campaigns and the trains was that dining cars and staff were always provided cheerfully, I would say. And in the case of the B&O, they could show off the superb cuisine for which our favorite railroad was known. And often there were even two different diners on these trains, even though they were seldom longer than about 15 cars. So the railroads were willing to put their best foot forward, and at least in the early 50s was certainly possible to host a decent campaign or a presidential train. And of course, in my book, nothing beats the opportunity to stand on the back platform of a great car like the Ferdinand Magellan or a business car, as in this case, in this photo, and greet the crowd. And here's a picture of Ike, who was in a way perhaps ambushed by a little crowd in a small town on the Canadian border in New York State. He's in his bathrobe in this picture, and supposedly his pajamas underneath. Whether that's actually true, I don't know. Some of these photo ops were a tad bit on the staged side, but at any rate, he is in his handsome bathrobe with a Mountie who just got on board as they were about to head across the Canadian border. So let's talk about trips on our favorite railroad, the B&O. There weren't a lot of them for Eisenhower, as we hinted at earlier. So there was a big campaign trip, part of which was in the B&O, mostly in West Virginia. That is on 2 days in 1952. There's a trip to Defiance College in Ohio, and I'll talk a lot about that, which has a lot to do with that menu I discovered. There was a really goofy short one from Washington Union Terminal to just a junction point within DC on March the 25th. We'll talk very briefly about that, but it still counts as a B&O trip. And we have a couple short ones that were very well supported by B&O, but unimpressive in length. We have Washington to Philly and Washington to Baltimore. Those were both campaign-related events, and we'll talk about them. And sadly, there was the Eisenhower funeral train, which B&O combined with C&O to host in very restrained and dignified fashion. We won't talk a lot about that, but we will touch on it a tad. Okay, let's start out with the campaign train. Eisenhower did do a couple of Truman-style campaign trains that were wildly successful. You can see in one occasion here, just a small town in the middle of nowhere, and a big crowd has showed up. This was so typical, mostly very well behaved. The railroads involved, B&O among them, ensured as much safety and security as they could. These were usually very, very upbeat, happy events. As was mentioned earlier, a lot of times the local politicians will make an appearance. Sometimes Mamie might be there. Eisenhower, if the train stopped, would make a short stump speech. Sometimes he was scheduled for a longer speech. These were generally very upbeat. People idolized Ike. It was hard to forget his wonderful performance in World War II and shortly afterward. Fantastic and well-loved individual. But while there was much adulation and admiration for Ike, and he could feel it, these trips by train that he did were not always as smooth and to his liking as he would like them to be. And I want to say right up front, it was not the railroad's fault. Usually this had to do with some of the people riding with him. So this was a direct quote from the president, well, candidate at that time. If I knew it was going to be like this, I would have jumped into the ocean on my way over. And what was the kind of thing that drove him to that? A lot of times it was the petty, small politicians who got on board, and the train would stop and the next set of politicians would come on board, usually, you know, state politicians, mayors, this kind of thing. They'd usually ride one or two stops, and some of those guys would try to get the train to stop in their town, even though there was no scheduled stop. Ike was a military man, and he didn't like that very much. He wanted to stick to schedule, and this frustrated the dickens out of him, and he said so. He blew his stack at one point in West Virginia on the B&O, and that was one of the things that really drove him to distraction, the sometimes petty behavior of the campaigners who joined him on the train. So the quote I just gave you is the direct quote. It's from one of his aides. I have no doubt it was authentic. It was probably said in a moment of not really despair, but in a down moment. As I say, it was mostly a very positive experience. Anybody who could marshal the Allied troops and keep peace with the Brits during World War II was a good politician. So it was just a matter of learning a different kind of politics and dealing with some of the pettiness and the grueling long trips that he endured. So this quote that I gave you about, gee, had I only known, was from this gentleman, Homer Grunther. And Grunther claims in an oral interview, and I wish I had a chance to read the whole thing, but I've seen the abstract. He claims he was a stand-in for Ike when the train passed through some small town. That is interesting. Does he look like Ike? Maybe a little. So it's possible that if they went through a small town and you pick a state at night, this guy might have been on the back of the platform waving to give Ike a break. That's my guess. Okay, so let's talk about Look Ahead Neighbor. Okay, that is the name of that I will give to the campaign train that we're going to talk about mostly in 1952. And this was actually on the drumhead, Look Ahead Neighbor. It started on September 15th in New York City. And after making a number of stops, it ended at St. Paul, Minnesota, because the president needed to get back to New York for an event. So he flew from there to New York and back. So he got back on the train at Rock Island, Illinois on the 18th. And after a number of adventures, he ended up in New York again on September the 27th, 1952. And here's a list of the various cities that he visited en route. So some very, very big places, well-known places, and I left off the legion of small towns that he went through, some of which he would stop in at times. Now, how about the B&O portion of Look Ahead Neighbor? This started on September the 24th in Columbus, Ohio, which of course was a B&O town. The diners on the train, which had been on other railroads, were cut off, and the B&O diners were put in. 2 B&O diners were put in. This is even though at this point it was actually an N&W train. So the consist of the train, which up to that point was pretty constant except for diners, it was going to remain the same except for our B&O additions here. So the train was mostly two-tone Pullman cars. It was a very dignified gray, two-tone gray scheme, which really was originated about the time of this campaign train, some say for this train. And the car that Ike rode in was a New York Central business car that was quite dignified and matched the gray rest of the train quite well. And the train used the N&W to stop in a couple of places, Southern Ohio and down that way, and was actually hauled by, among other locomotives, N&W 611, which I thought was interesting. I haven't found a decent picture, unfortunately, and I apologize. There are very few actual train pictures in this presentation. It's mostly about the people who made the trains run. But 611 was a key player on this train, which must have been a beauty, headed down to Southern Ohio and into West Virginia. So at Canova, West Virginia, the train was handed over to the B&O. So B&O took the train to Huntington, to Parkersburg, and to Wheeling. And there were some really interesting glitches in the schedule at Wheeling due to what I will call political intrigue. And this involves largely whether Richard Nixon would in fact become Ike's running mate. Ike honestly was not super enthused about Richard Nixon, but for political reasons, he probably needed to take him on. So I will not bore you with a lot of political talk, but because of some things that were going on, which even resulted in the famous Checkers speech, a scandal involving Richard Nixon, some portions of the schedule involving what Ike was going to do at Wheeling and even involving the B&O trains to some extent had to change. And I mentioned earlier that Ike really didn't like that kind of thing, being a good military man. By the way, after the 611 and 613 of N&W were cut off, briefly we had an N&W switcher, but then we put on a nice set of B&O F7 units, I think 4 of them, 2 A's and 2 B's. Okay. So if you want to hear some more about this, what I call political intrigue, there's an excellent item. This is Bob Withers' work, an article that appeared in Trains magazine, I think it's February 1990, called Campaigning on the B&O. It says Ike's Trains 1, Ike's Trains 2 was primarily or exclusively the funeral train. It was in a different issue. Excellent article if you like reading about politics and the way journalists and politicians interacted. It's really interesting. I found it in spots gripping. This was such a nice article that eventually Bob came up with an entire book called The President Travels by Train. And the campaigning on the B&O article is almost word for word in that book, with some additional material and a lot of material about other presidents. Very interesting, a lot of good photographs. I can highly recommend what Bob did here, and I have built on it, trying not to duplicate it too much. So back to what was going on with the campaign train on the B&O. So September 25th, the train went from Wheeling to Grafton to Kaiser. And here's a shot of the train at Kaiser. Again, this is New York Central business car number 17. Ike and Mamie were both on the rear and high spirits, and made one of their stump speeches. Very well received, very friendly crowd as always. I think the weather was pretty good too. And on this Look Ahead Neighbor special, the train went from Cumberland to Martinsburg, where Ike got off the train. And he met with the railroaders. And this is a shot which I really like of Ike meeting with Martinsburg B&O employees. I don't know who the gentleman in the hat is. There's the dressed up gentleman. I wish I did. And maybe with some further research, I will find out, or maybe someone out there can tell me. But I love this shot. This is just a gorgeous picture of how our future president interacted with the average man, and he really did admire the guys who kept the railroads going and complicated organizations like railroads going. He loved that. Okay, so then Ike got in a motorcade and went to Hagerstown, where he spoke on what he called poor leadership in government, presumably implying the Democrats had that going. And he also spoke on the Bill of Rights. A lot of Ike's speeches, even short ones, were fairly, I would say, high-minded. There was a lot of talk of government philosophy. It wasn't all down and dirty politics by any means. Okay, so back again to the B&O route for September 25th. He got back on the train at Frederick. The train had been rearranged for him there. They tried never to back a presidential train, so everything was all properly arranged at Frederick for him to get on, and he rode to Silver Spring. Okay, now at Frederick, I forgot to mention he made a speech on these topics, very government oriented, so military pay, et cetera, et cetera. At Silver Spring, closer to DC, he gave a speech on government failures at home and abroad. Gosh, the civil service, which he admired, I think, but maybe perhaps wanted to downsize, and what was good for America. And then he rode again on the B&O portion of Look Ahead Neighbor. He rode to Baltimore. At Baltimore, it was already getting pretty late, but he had a rapturous reception there. You can see from this photo that the streets were packed. The local Republicans had organized a proper reception, and Ike gave a major speech on the kind of things that he would be expected to be strong on, namely defense policy and leadership overseas. So, still on the 25th of September 1952, Ike boarded the train at Camden Station, which departed about 22:45 and got to Washington Union Terminal 23:30 or so. And at that point, the B&O relinquished control of the train, and the Southern Railway was going to take over because Ike was headed south. He went as far south as the Carolinas on the rest of this trip. So he departed the terminal just after midnight on September 26th with the Southern Railway in control. And later on the remainder of this trip, he traveled on the rails of the NW, Atlantic Coast Line, Richmond, Frederick, and Potomac, and he ended up going PRR from Washington back to New York. The campaign trip by train terminated then in New York on the morning of the 27th. So let's talk about, I don't know if we can get rid of this thing on the top. I really would like to. All right, can't see how to do it, but here we go. October 14th and 15th, 1953. This is the one I'd like to talk about a little more. Defiance College. Let me go back a second if I can. Went too fast. Ike had some trusted confidants, and one of them is a gentleman in the center of this screen, a man named Kevin McCann. And sometimes in biographies or articles about Ike, he's dismissed sort of, offhandedly as a speechwriter. That's all he was. Actually, he was much more than that. He was a confidant, friend. He was with Ike when Ike was at Columbia University in New York, when Ike, after the war, went to SHAPE, went to NATO headquarters in Europe. McCann was with him there. And before I forget, after Eisenhower left the presidency, there were times when McCann traveled with the former president. So he was a very loyal friend, and they were very close. And for example, Ike helped McCann get the job as president of Defiance College in Defiance, Ohio. McCann returned the favor to a degree by having the nice choir from Defiance College sing at the inauguration. And I think it was probably a major role. It wasn't necessarily quite a a cast of thousands like some of the inaugurations are today. I think that really that was quite an important role for a small but well-drilled choir. So there was a close relationship between these men, and Ike figured that yes, he owed McCann a visit at his university, and his college, I should say, at Defiance. He had agreed to do that and was all set to do that in September 53. And they had actually done things like work on the runways at the nearest airport. They had come up with hundreds of special cigars saying Ike's visit, September 53, blah, blah, blah. And at the last minute, Ike had to change and he couldn't make it. The president couldn't make it. He had to do something else. So he apologized profusely and he rescheduled, and he agreed he would come in October 53 and dedicate the new library at Defiance College. So a quick look at a B&O route map. Basically, the train to Defiance took the same route as, say, the Capital Limited. So we're talking B&O, the most scenic parts of the B&O, the P&LE through the Pittsburgh area, and then back onto B&O rails and to Defiance, which is a little bit south and west of Toledo. And interestingly, you may remember that I found a menu that said Ike's trip to Toledo, which of course was not entirely on the B&O. And he actually traveled at the end of the trip on another railroad, which we'll talk about briefly. So he took a special presidential train from Washington to Defiance, spending the night on the train, and then a shuttle train, as it were, to Toledo. So this Defiance trip was added to the front of a very long road trip, and Mrs. Eisenhower would not go along on this one. I don't have the entire story, but as I mentioned, she did not like to fly very much. And for the president to make this trip go comfortably, he did need to fly because he needed to make a fairly major speech on an agricultural theme at Kansas City. He needed to touch base with some people he knew in Abilene and his relatives. He was headed to New Orleans and eventually to Texas, where he helped dedicate a new dam, a cooperative project of sorts. I guess in a sense it was cooperative, but it was a US-Mexican dam, which Ike ended up visiting. I think it was called Falcon Dam, something like that. Okay, so earlier Steve showed us the kind of instructions that you might find in connection with one of these presidential trips. This is a similar set of instructions that I found in our B&O Historical Society archives down in the basement. One portion of the instructions for the B&O portion, well, it's all B&O trip to Defiance. So this is from Cumberland to UN Tower in Pennsylvania. Okay, this of course would incorporate the P&LE portion of the journey, but it's very similar to what Steve showed you earlier. I will summarize it. I won't show you everything, but I'll give you some idea of what was going on with these instructions. They talked in not great detail, but somewhat about how they were going to cooperate with the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. The consist of the train was specified, and we'll show you that shortly. They named all of the crews who were going to operate the train. I mean, by name. We're not just saying put your best engineer on. They named the best engineer and the best fireman and the conductor. The schedule was given down to the minute, and they tried, as Steve pointed out, they tried to keep to these on the presidential trains in those days. So on this portion of it, from Cumberland to UN Tower, it was 2:40 a.m. to 7:12 a.m. Of course, it started at Washington Union Terminal in another B&O division, so they would have had their own set of instructions. But very carefully specified was the fact that you did not back this train. This was a big rule, an important rule for presidential trains. They did not want to back up. All the nearby freight trains were to stop. No switching was to occur. They had all of the relief trains identified in case something derailed. They had them specified. At Cumberland, it would be this. At Newcastle, it would be this, blah, blah, blah. It went on and on. So-called protect locomotives were allocated. So you were going to have certain locomotives at this location. Go down the line a little bit, there would be more locomotives there. The type of locomotives, specific B&O officials, big ones, were to be on the train. And other key division level people were to be assigned to specific locations, towers, stations, offices. Everybody had his place. And of course, in those days, there were many more railroad employees. So it was a lot easier to man up, so to speak. Interestingly, there were Western Maryland pilots on board. I believe they probably got on in DC, but I'm not sure about that one. But at least they were on board from Cumberland to Connellsville. Why? Because in theory, the parallel Western Maryland line could have been used in an emergency. There was a fairly easy connection at Cumberland, probably do it, was it Cherry Run? It would have been a little tougher after Cumberland to do that, but perhaps possible to connect. But they did have some Western Maryland people on board, probably mostly in case the train needed to transfer over to Western Maryland at Cumberland. Okay, employees were assigned to watch the road crossings. The various facing point switches, I think about a dozen of them, were to be spiked. They stated where these switches were, and by God, you're going to spike these things. There were people assigned to certain bridges and tunnels and even cuts, and they were termed watchmen, and they were going to stay there for the time the train passed. Here was to consist, we had B&O power, so E8AMs, 2 of those and a B unit, a B&O baggage car, coach 3660. Then, this is interesting. This is one of the semi-mysteries for me of this trip. Notice you have here B&O office car 902. And it is stated in the memo, observation end will be forward. And we're going to designate in the train this as car 1. So in essence, 3660 was just a buffer car. Okay. This was pretty unusual. Presidential trains and campaign trains almost always had the Magellan or a business car at the end of the train. Now, Withers suggests that a politician rather than a railroad man was worried about the Magellan, the aging Magellan, and handling the train, and perhaps to some extent security, and decided that they were going to put the Magellan third on the train. And in fact, he has a published consist in his book, which shows the Magellan, but it did not travel. I have photographs, which I'll show you shortly, in this memo to indicate it was the 902 that actually ran. So there was no particular reason that they could not have had 902 on the rear, and it's a doggone shame. So this turned out to be an unusual and very irritating thing for Ike. He really, really was unhappy about the way this all ended up. So after 902, where it was a Pullman sleeping car, another one, then one of the wonderful B&O diners. Here, by the way, is the interior of that menu I showed you earlier. They had a nice red, white, and blue braid on the menu. The B&O went all out on this. This is breakfast, and you can see the wonderful food they had here. You could get a half grapefruit if you wanted, or a chilled melon, variety of choices of bacon and eggs and that sort of thing. Rolls and jelly and coffee. Sounds doggone good. Wasn't what I had for breakfast this morning, although I didn't do badly with fresh strawberries. But it was first-class B&O diner service, no doubt. So this is what the staff, the presidential staff, and the reporters would have awakened to. Now, obviously, Eisenhower himself would have dined in the 902. Continuing on the consist, the diner is in the middle. You had a sleeper car, another one. That one was called car 5, by the way. Then you had a sleeper of a different variety for the dining car crew, okay? So they were well taken care of as well. And finally, this was the replacement for that leased B&O car that had been used for communications all during the Truman era. It was a purpose-built car called the General Albert J. Meyer, and it had much more modern stuff inside, operated by military personnel. So this was to accompany all future presidential trains, the Albert J. Meyer communications car. So the train departed Washington Union Terminal late in the evening, and the first stop was actually at Willard, good B&O place. This is a shot from Life magazine. You can see that here he is. That's the back. Here's the marker light. That's the 902, and there's the buffer car. And poor Ike is over here, not used at all to having to lean over and be unable to greet the crowd properly. So he got to Willard just before 10 o'clock on October 15th. And here's what he had to say, this big quote. You know, I had to shout out loud when I was a little younger. I'm not sure I can shout loud enough. And this really bothered him. It really did. So he was kind of unhappy. He told the crowd he sure wished he could be heard better. He made a short speech nonetheless, and he called for the U.S. to retain its position of self-respect and decency in the world. And I would have to say that most of the people who went to see Ike really believed that he was largely responsible for that position of respect. Now, this is where it gets kind of fun and funky on the Defiance trip. I really enjoyed researching this one. I discovered when looking around that, hey, there was a Life magazine article about this trip. I said, okay, I'll find out more about the trip. Well, I didn't find out a lot about the trip. I got the picture you saw earlier, which I'd marked with an arrow at this point. And you can see it helped me confirm again that the 902 was used and not the Magellan, and it was in that odd place on the train. But there's also a strange extra story here. It seems that when the train came there to Willard, a young man who is marked with this arrow here pushed his way as well he could to the front of the crowd and handed something to the president. It was an invitation to come to a chili dinner and homecoming and a football game at Willard. And at first they thought he was coming, but the president sent his regrets with plenty of time in advance. They knew he wasn't coming, but for some reason, there were a number of pictures like this that appeared in Life magazine of posed, semi-disconsolate, I would say, students who were waiting for Ike. And this, frankly, this article flummoxed me. The editor of Life magazine was a fairly conservative guy. I just don't understand why they did this article. But it was called The Man Who Didn't Come to Dinner. And there are several pictures here of all of the well-scrubbed, all-American students of Willard, many of them probably sons and daughters of railroad men, who looked doggone disappointed. And here is a special box. It wasn't exactly Roman marble that was made, but they did make a special box for the president and Mamie to watch the football game. And they left it, even though they knew he wasn't coming. And they put a couple of chairs out for Ike and Mamie, and even had flowers for Mamie at the homecoming. Again, I have no idea that why a major magazine like this would run a story with little subtitles like "No Ike." I found this very fun to read and a little bit strange. So moving on up the line, this was not quite like the campaign trains. He didn't really stop that often. He had a busy day ahead. So it wasn't quite like the campaign with a lot of whistle stops. He arrived at the Defiance station of the B&O, which was really quite dignified. It was an unusual plan, I would say, because it's a two-level station, but lovely brick and tile roof, a very handsome station. No president would be ashamed to detrain there. Very good spot Unfortunately, this station burned in 2005. It had been used as a maintenance away facility at that time, and it was destroyed. Very sad, because I think it was quite a handsome building, especially with these arched windows. And the colors, which I'm sorry you can't see in this photo. I couldn't find a photo I had the rights to in color, but it was, trust me, it looked good. Even burnt, it looked pretty good. Okay, so Ike was greeted in a friendly fashion. All the local politicians came out. That's the mayor. The gentleman back here is the governor, who I believe was a Democrat. Okay, so local senator, Republican, and this is Mr. McCann we talked about earlier. So they were on hand to give him a very dignified greeting as he got off the train. And Ike and his friend Kevin McCann got into a gorgeous open convertible for a ride through part of downtown from the Defiance station to the college. And here you can see there was a throng all along the way. He did go through a sort of built up area of Defiance on Clinton Street, one of the main streets. But here, getting close to Defiance, there were still people in what was kind of an out of the sticks area at that time, with Secret Service guys nearby. So Ike gave a very dignified speech, which I will excerpt momentarily, and he did the ceremonial laying of the cornerstone of a new library at Defiance College. This was a big deal for Defiance College. I understand that was the first really new building they'd had since World War I. So they were really proud of this building. And incidentally, I went to Defiance. I was up in that neck of the woods for a B&O event, and I think it was the Toledo Convention. And I took a trip down there to check out Defiance College and some of the railroad facilities that might remain. And I went into the building that had this cornerstone. And it's kind of interesting. I was this old guy prowling around what is now the student union and offices. And the students are looking at this old guy who's very interested in odd things inside their building. It turns out I went all around the building. I couldn't find a cornerstone. I said, what the heck? Went inside and talked to some of the college officials, and they said, we rebuilt the library. That cornerstone is now in so-and-so's office. It is now indoors. They offered to let me in, but they said so-and-so was at lunch, which, it was lunchtime when I was there. And unfortunately, I had to get back for, I don't know, a board meeting or something, and I wasn't able to stay. But they would have let me in to take a picture of the cornerstone, which I understand is now on the wall of somebody's office. Now, here's a little bit of his speech. He talked about how he was very fond of Kevin McCann and his wife Ruth, and I have no doubt that that was true. If there was anything that Eisenhower was, it was loyal. He really appreciated service by some of his faithful followers, and especially capable ones like Kevin McCann. But he made a point of talking about his faith in education and the importance of education in the world. And he would always talk about service, the citizen who was able to serve his country. He thought that was very important. And you Ohioans, I believe this was the 150th anniversary of Ohio statehood, so that was another reason for, ostensibly anyway, for the trip. And before I forget, Kevin McCann wrote an interesting book called The Man from Abilene, which was published during the campaign, actually, rather than now when he was president. And there was a lot of emphasis in that book on how Eisenhower expected people to become educated and then to see that they needed to serve their country and the world. Now, I mentioned earlier that another railroad was going to be used to get to Toledo. Obviously, there wasn't a very direct B&O route there. It could have been done, but for one thing, they didn't like to back trains. I told you that earlier. So there was a secondary Wabash Railroad main line from Defiance all the way up to Toledo. So it was decided they'd use the Wabash. But this is much rebuilt, the Wabash station in Toledo. Not much. I don't think it was much in the day. As I mentioned, it was a secondary main line. This wasn't the route that the Cannonball took or anything like that. It was still in good shape, pretty good shape, but it was not, high-class Wabash real estate. So they decided, maybe we don't want to use this. So there's another reason why they didn't want to use this station. It was because they would have had to double back, and I'll show you why momentarily. Here's a map of Defiance. It's a little too modern for 1953, but bear with me. The B&O, if you can see my cursor, comes in from the right. It runs pretty much east and west all the way through this Defiance area. That's a good high-speed main line even today. I watched a freight or two come through here at a good clip. And the Wabash ran roughly diagonally through this picture. Here's the Wabash secondary main line. The B&O station that Eisenhower detrained at would be right about here. It was right adjacent to a main road, Clinton Street, so he was able to motorcade through some big buildings, built up areas here, and right on up to Defiance College. Now, I mentioned the Wabash station, the dinky one, was over here, so they didn't really want to go there. They could have gone all the way back to the B&O station, but apparently they didn't want to worry about the security of going all the way back again. Sort of a, well, we did that already sort of thing, and time was precious. So what happened? Well, Wabash made a very generous offer. They actually made a temporary platform. I wouldn't call it a station, but since the main line actually was doggone close to the southern edge of Defiance College, they actually built a platform over a period of several days. So we mentioned they had the main line. Once they got to Toledo, there were all kinds of connections in those days with other railroads. And the security really did dictate that they didn't want to go back to the B&O station, dignified though it may have been, a beautiful station though it may have been. And also, and I haven't been able to run this one down too much, the Wabash president, Mr. Atkinson, may have had some kind of connection. I don't know what it is. I wasn't able to run it down, but I noted that Atkinson was one of, I don't know, maybe 12, 15 male guests invited to a White House stag luncheon, not all that long after what we're talking about today. So there could have been some kind of connection that I don't know about between the president of the Wabash and Ike. Okay, so Wabash from Defiance to Toledo. The B&O train was turned and it was reshuffled. And guess what? 902 was at the back. Here's a shot from Defiance College files. Beautiful shot. And you can see it's 902. This is not Ferdinand Magellan. And you can see he's got that big happy grin and he is on the back of the train. And boy, was he much, much happier with that. Okay, and the train departed at 12:30. So they put a nice spiffy looking Wabash E8 unit on the front. And I must tell you, I grew up in St. Louis when those units in the so-called Bluebird scheme were clean. They were stunners. I have to say, even better than a B&O unit. Sorry, guys, but they really were. They were beautiful. So the train was the B&O equipment that we talked about earlier, presumably. I doubt they even changed the diner, but I don't know. And from here, it gets a little hazy. I tried to contact Wabash historical people, C&O people. I even talked to the Toledo terminal guy who addressed our convention. I have been unable to pin down the exact route this train took to a place called Metcalf Field, which was the big airport for Toledo at the time. I have some ideas. Okay, this is a 1953 map of the Toledo area. The Toledo terminal is the belt line around the city. We talked about this at our convention, and the Wabash came up roughly paralleling the Maumee River, and Wabash territory ended at the river, at which point I believe the train went to Pennsylvania Railroad, and at this point would have transferred to C&O. And there's a big C&O yard here with all kinds of facilities, including, from what I understand, was a kind of simple station for the employees at Walbridge. It's the Walbridge yard. Now, on the other hand, it's possible, and I think Withers suggests that they went on PRR. I don't think so, because it was kind of field over here, I think, in those days. It's built up now. This is the PRR line. It was on the other side of Metcalf. But as I said, C&O had pretty good facilities over here, pretty close to the airport. And one of the local reporters who did a good job of reporting on the Defiance side of the trip states that the trip went to C&O. So there's conflicting information. What I need to do is get to the Secret Service records in Abilene, and because of the pandemic, I have not been able to get out there. So I really hope to do that sometime in the future, and stay tuned. I will give you the answer if I am totally wrong on how Ike's train got to Metcalf Field. This, by the way, is still an airport. It's now the Toledo Executive Airport. So when Ike got on the plane, it was a Columbine 2. He had to fly to Kansas City, and he made it with a little time to rest and so forth. You might ask, why didn't he take the Wabash all the way? It would have been possible. Wabash, while it was secondary main line to Defiance, it wasn't for very long. If you'd gone south, you could have gotten to the real high-speed Wabash, and they had passenger trains that could have run all the way to Kansas City. But stop and think about all the security involved with hundreds of rail grade crossings to secure that sort of thing. It would have been tremendously costly for the Wabash, and it would have taken a lot of time, despite the fact that they had some crack passenger trains on that railroad and some very flat, high-speed track. So Ike really needed to fly, and of course he needed to get down to New Orleans from Kansas. It was much faster flying. Okay, so let's talk about now another trip. This is a separate trip, of course, and this is the strange short one. This is Ike's trip, which was a very few miles on the B&O, but it was on the B&O. This is March 25th, 1956. So Ike was on his way to the Greenbrier in West Virginia, a very posh resort, very important to the leadership of government and business officials on the East Coast in those days. And he was down there to do some important business. And it was quite a fancy train put on by the C&O, basically. But to get there, they had to leave Washington Union Terminal. And the security people said, well, we don't want you to leave from the certain platforms, I think it was the lower ones, that could have taken the train directly down there onto Southern Railroad and C&O and down to the Greenbrier. They said, we want you to go north so you can use this certain platform at this time of day. And guess what? It was a B&O type operation they had in mind. So we had to have a B&O crew take a short journey. They took this C&O train. It had a C&O locomotive, and I believe it was 100% C&O consist. C&O business car, no Ferdinand Magellan. They had a B&O crew take the train from the station over to a junction with the PRR, just so they didn't have to turn the train around or back it, which was a big no-no. So B&O from the station to Anacostia Junction, at which time, and again, this is a little weird, they had to have PRR guys take over. They were in the cab, and they took over there, and they took it down to the end of their jurisdiction. And at that time, C&O took over. I think they were actually technically on Southern track, but they let them have some trackage rights. So they had 3 different train crews on the locomotive. It was probably pretty crowded there. And they continued uneventfully to the Greenbrier Resort. So I wanted to include this one. B&O very capably carried the train a few miles, but that was the extent of their participation. Okay, now let's talk about a different one. This is Ike's trip to Philadelphia, November '56. And again, they did a really nice fancy menu. This one's in better shape than the one I found, the poor one I found. Now, unfortunately, this was the holder, and I don't know what was inside, but I'm sure it was typical, wonderful B&O food. So this was Ike going to a convention in Philadelphia. So not tough for either the Penzi or the B&O to do, but they chose the B&O, possibly because of B&O's superb security and service, but it could also have been because the train terminated at a spot nearer where they wanted to go. That kind of thing was definitely a consideration. But B&O definitely distinguished themselves on this trip, as all presidential trips. Here's the consist. Okay, E8A units, 2 of them. Okay, then numbered 30 and 38. So a crew coach, sleepers, a nice B&O diner, et cetera, et cetera. Here's our friend, the General Meyer, Pullman 63, and this time B&O office car 100. Okay, so again, no Ferdinand Magellan. Eisenhower seldom used it, and if I didn't mention it before, Mamie actually used it more than he did for some solo trips she took. So first class B&O train here, a lot of great equipment, everything that was needed for that train. The special departed Washington Union Terminal in early evening hours, arrived at the Philadelphia station of B&O. There's a motorcade to Convention Hall, and he gave a speech. Wasn't too lengthy a speech, left the hall, look at that, only a half hour later, basically. Got to the station quickly, and his train departed, and another quick trip down to Washington Union Terminal. How about the speech? He referred to this being the final address of his campaign. So this was not his campaign, but national campaign. He was elected 52. Wait a minute, hang on a second. I'm getting confused here. But anyway, final address of his campaign. And he was talking about some of his favorite themes here. Infrastructure. He was a little ahead of his time. Okay, he even talked about slum clearance, which was a big deal, I guess. Unfortunately, for many American cities, there was a lot of modernism and not just slum clearance in the 50s and 60s. A lot of beautiful buildings were destroyed. But anyway, he was talking about providing for the welfare of the people with public housing, public health, and he talked about promoting civil rights and education. But as always, Ike was calling for what he called greatness of heart and largeness of vision when dealing with the rest of the world. Now, it's interesting, at the time here, you may recall that the Soviets had invaded Hungary, which was straying a little too much from the staid Soviet way of doing things. And the US had decided not to intervene in any significant way. And there had been an adventure involving our French and British allies at the Suez Canal. And again, the US had not gotten involved, although the Allies had anticipated that we would. And Ike, in fact, was sort of proud of that and stated it in this speech. So, interesting speech. Now, another trip for us. October 31st, 1958. A real short one here. The B&O hosted the Eisenhower entourage in a short but well-equipped train. They went from Washington Union Terminal to our beautiful Mount Royal station, and then a short motorcade to the historic 5th Regiment Armory building. Gorgeous building, still there today. Nice museum in there. Why do I say it's historic? Well, ironically, in 1912, the Democrats had their national convention in that building. So it's kind of interesting that Eisenhower chose to get his Republican entourage into the same structure for a very political sort of event. Okay, here was the consist on this one. It's a little bit hazier because I wasn't able to pin down the exact numbers of the power or the coaches. A lot of times Bob Withers has come up with some information, and I've leaned on that here. So we know that there were two coaches, a diner, we don't know which one, and our friendly communications car, and again, our friend 902. Beautiful car, well used, and definitely on the end of the train this time, although I don't believe it stopped anywhere. And of course, Mount Royal looked great in those days. This was actually a little earlier, about 37, I guess, but it was a showcase for B&O. What a beautiful station. And it's a gorgeous structure today. Now, we have an article about this trip. The B&O was proud of it, and they decided to show people how things worked in the day and what kind of good things they did to put a train together. So I was able to pull some photos of this, and I think you'll be able to read some of them. But they're showing the check-in for passengers at Washington, okay, and the various people. There's a mix of B&O people and White House people involved in this effort. Great photos. Now they showed the conductor and the chief attendant of the train, named them. Very cool. Well deserved. I'm sure they were extremely trusted employees, or they would not have been given this assignment. And here you see a couple of B&O officials and the White House communications expert, supposedly, okay, the gentleman, I guess, in the lighter suit. And at this time, notice they had a nice train phone. They could speak with the engineer in the cab. So what was in those days fairly modern technology. But again, interesting semi-posed photo, but gives you some idea for how things were done in the day. When the train arrived, and this appears to be the back of 902, as was typical, the president would have been greeted by local politicians. So you have here, for example, you have the governor of Maryland, Mr. McKeldin, who incidentally had introduced B&O as the Republican candidate, I believe in 52, I think it was. This gentleman wanted to succeed Mr. McKeldin as Maryland governor. And this is then Maryland Senator Glenn Beall. Now, was it a good thing to be associated with Ike? Undoubtedly, yes, but did it make sure you were going to win? It did not. This gentleman lost the election, which was a few days later, I guess. He did not become governor, and Senator Beall just narrowly won. He won, I think, with 51% of the vote. So, you know, being associated with Ike was good, but not necessarily going to give you a shoe-in for the election. Incidentally, this gentleman defeated the father of Nancy Pelosi in that very close race. And here they are in a nice vehicle headed up the hill from Mount Royal to the beautiful armory. And meanwhile, the B&O magazine article made sure to show the functionality and cozy appearance of the B&O diner that was used. I love this photo. I think it's cool. And keep in mind that most of these guys would have been reporters, or in some cases staffers, but in this case, I think they're almost all reporters having a bite to eat while the president speaks. And do they look happy? I think they do. I doubt this is posed. I think this is pretty much a candid. And does that ever look like a nice car? And I am quite sure that it was a good meal. And here's how I know. And I thank Alan, who gave me another copy of this menu, but there are some around. You can buy them on eBay occasionally. But here's the menu that was used. Yum. Chesapeake Bay fish, or a nice golden omelet if you're a vegetarian. And if you want to splurge, a big sirloin steak. And of course, the famous B&O help yourself salad bowl, and all the fixins here, and some other choices you could add on. Now, it wasn't dirt cheap. I tried to find out how much $4 was in today's money, and I think it runs up there to, maybe it's not a fair comparison, maybe about 36, $40, something like that, for a meal with tip. Not cheap if you got the steak. And still, I think it was probably a wonderful meal, and I think a lot of the reporters charge it to the office. Okay, and again, a shot or two from B&O magazine. Here's the press guys harassing the poor White House press representative on the train. So they did their job, all did their job. I don't have any reason to believe that there was any unfavorable press coverage from this speech. So when he got up to the convention hall, he was courteously greeted by Republican officials, all, again, very nicely dressed. This was probably a candid shot, but it looks like everything is just ironed, starched. This presumably Secret Service guy over here, because he's not smiling. The only guy who meets Ike who doesn't smile, I suggest. So again, this was a well-oiled operation. It may only have been from Washington to Baltimore, but the B&O had an important part in making sure it all flowed well. The speech involved Ike's call for honest, progressive government, and he was proud of the fact he'd ended the war in Korea. One might argue that point to a degree that maybe Truman and Stevenson could have ended it without Ike. It's hard to say. He said there was economic prosperity. Now, some of you readers of history may recall there was actually a recession in 1958. Not all that long before this trip, unemployment was quite high as late as July, and this is November. So Ike made a reference to those people who blamed him for causing the recession. He called them gloomdogglers. Cool word. I don't know where that one came from. So I don't know what he would have, what today's president might have called his opponents, but Ike came up with this coined word, gloomdoggler. Now, we're running long, so I'm only going to talk briefly about the funeral train. C&O and B&O teamed up to make a very appropriate funeral train, and it may be the subject of another presentation for the future. But suffice it to say that it was mostly a C&O show out of Washington Union Terminal on March 31st. But when the train got to Cincinnati, the B&O took over. The lead unit became E9A 1457, and the train traveled the St. Louis Division all the way to Union Station, where N&W took over with some curious passenger Jeeps rather than their nice Wabash E units. I don't know why. And UP did the final honors from, whoops, yeah, well, okay, it would have been Kansas City to Abilene. So N&W from St. Louis to Kansas City, UP, Kansas City, Abilene. Okay, and I found this rather appropriate, sad photo of the train passing through B&O territory through one of our iconic searchlight signals. There's plenty of good reading out there. If you liked this presentation, I hope you did. If you're curious about some things, or if you want to refute what that stupid Mike says, you can get some of these books and learn more. Here's that great book by Bob Withers. But I decided, and I read this very thick book on Truman. I wanted to get the background. I went even further because I heard this was a good book, and it is. FDR's Funeral Train. Very interesting book. Very good stuff. A lot of politics involved there and some railroading. This is Kevin McCann's book, The Man from Abilene. I enjoyed that. Not a bad book, easy reading, a little bit on the Eisenhower sainthood side, but he was a great guy. I don't think there was a lot in the way of things hidden in the closet when it came to Ike. And you can find various books on the president himself, lots and lots. This one I found pretty good and fairly readable. So I can highly recommend learning more about presidential trains and the president himself. So at this point, are there any questions or comments? I will entertain them. gosh, the connection was broken an hour ago.
Mike, a lot of good positive comments. I thank you for your presentation. It was delightful. I had missed it prior, and I'm sure glad I had the opportunity to see it now. You know, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break here before we move to David Lang.